Lecture number 12. We will begin on slide 134. I should offer a brief apology. In the last lecture, I also indicated that was lecture 12, and that was a misnomer on my part. I apologize for that. It should have been labeled lecture 11. This one is, in fact, lecture 12, and we will in this lecture talk about chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Nehemiah and the finishing of the walls and the gates of the city of Jerusalem. Slide 135. As you begin chapter 5 of Nehemiah, you immediately run into a problem that confronted the post-exilic community that have returned from Persia to Jerusalem. They're working on the walls daily with the threats surrounding them, some of them with their sword in their hand, others guarding those who were working on the wall. But all of this daily toil on the walls meant that the normal activities of farming and trade had been suspended. Most of the people who had come back from the exile to Jerusalem were probably farmers. Some of them may have been merchants or businessmen, but in any case, whatever their occupation was for their daily sustenance, that had to be suspended because of their work on the wall. So as you begin chapter 5, you begin with the statement that the men and their wives raised this great outcry against their Jewish brothers, and some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous, and in order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." The redirection of their labor took its toll, and they were losing their income and their basic staples of life for supporting themselves and their families. Some of the families had been obliged to use their farms as security for loans, as you discover in verse 3. Some were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Well, with the mortgage of their farms and using their farms as security for loans in order to get enough money to eat with, there was the threat of foreclosure because they could not pay back those loans. And particularly, to make it even more of a problem, they were required to pay taxes to the Persian government because they were a province of Persia. And so you'll notice in verse 4, some were saying we had to borrow money in order to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. And so entire families were put at risk in this situation. It was very precarious and very disheartening for them at this time. Some of them who were in the most desperate circumstances apparently had sold some of their children or family members into debt slavery. Now, debt slavery is perhaps something that is not as well known because it's a different type of slavery than what we are accustomed to thinking if we're thinking of the kinds of slavery that happened in the 18th and 19th century with Africans taken to England and to America and put into slavery. But what you have is in the ancient Near East, you have a way of handling debts by offering family members as debt slaves for a limited tenure. Now, you find this not only in Israel, but you find this throughout the ancient Near East. It was a very common practice to do what is sometimes called self-sale in the ancient Near East, or the sale of family members. And so hunger or debt would drive people to sell their children or themselves into debt slavery. Now, this was a voluntary self-enslavement to pay off a debt. We find records of this in the Nuzi text, for instance, of Mesopotamia, which was quite a long time earlier than the period of Persia, but all the way back in the Hurrian Mesopotamian town of Nuzi, which was excavated between 1925 and 1931. Some 20,000 clay tablets were uncovered in Nuzi, and among these there were descriptions of family laws and customs and family wills and marriage contracts, business records, land sales, all that sort of thing. But one of the things that they discovered in the Nuzi text was also references to self-sale in order to pay off debts, the sale of oneself for a period of time in order to handle a debt. This same type of circumstance is envisioned in the law of Moses, and you find references to it in Exodus and in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. In fact, we will just briefly look at the passage in Deuteronomy, which is in chapter 15, which says, if a fellow Hebrew, a man or woman, is sold to you, and he serves you 6 years, in the 7th year, you must let him go free. And when you release him, do not send him away empty-handed. Supply him liberally. Now, the issue here, of course, is that the tenure on debt slavery for Israelites were 7 years, or 6 years, and then released in the 7th year. The people in the time of Nehemiah apparently had already begun this process of selling members of their family into debt slavery. And so, they're in really a disheartening situation. They say in verse 5, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because of our fields and our vineyards belong to others. In other words, they could not pay off the debt, so they could not buy back their members from this kind of debt slavery. Slide 135. I'm sorry, slide 136. Nehemiah's solution was that this sort of interest charging on loans needed to stop, and it should stop with the wealthy. They needed to take the lead in relieving the distress of the community. There was a general meeting, and in this meeting, Nehemiah chastised the wealthy because they were taking advantage of their fellow Jews. He says in verse 6, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are exacting usury from your own countrymen. And so I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles, but now you're selling your own brothers, only for them to be sold back to us. No one knew what to say to this because they knew it was actually true. The fact that they had bought back Jewish brothers that were sold to Gentiles, we don't really know what circumstances surrounded that, whether that had to do with Persians or whether that had to do with locals that were in opposition to the building project to start with. But in any case, Nehemiah certainly rebuked his fellow Jews because they were charging exorbitant interest like the pagans did by negotiating harsh terms of repayment. In fact, if you look a little bit ahead at verse 11, you will notice it says that the usury that was charged, or the interest that was charged, was 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil. Now, many scholars believe that this 100th part refers to monthly interest rather than annual interest. And if that is true, then the annual interest would have been about 12%. Which is a pretty high interest rate. And especially was this a problem because this was exactly what the Torah forbid the Jews to do to each other. If you look at these statutes in Exodus 22 or Leviticus 25 or Deuteronomy 23, it is very clear that among their fellow Jews who loaned money or loaned oil or loaned grain to their fellow Jewish families were not supposed to charge interest. And so Nehemiah demanded that this needed to stop. This was what the Torah required. If they're going to be a covenant community and they're going to be faithful to the Torah, then this type of exploitation of their fellow Jews needed to stop immediately. So as Nehemiah continued, he says, what you're doing isn't right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? And of course, one of the things that was mentioned back in the Torah is you should not charge interest because you feared the Lord. And so Nehemiah says, I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but we're not charging interest. So let this interest stop, this usury stop. Give back to them immediately their fields and vineyards and olive groves and houses, and give back the usury that you're charging, this 100th part of the money, whether this was a monthly charge, which is what I tend to think it was, or otherwise. But nonetheless, they needed to stop this type of interest charging. Furthermore, Nehemiah even pronounces a curse upon those that would violate that. They, of course, agreed, and they said, we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. But then Nehemiah took the priests and the nobles and the officials, and he made them take oath to do what they had promised. And he gave a sign of that oath, which was shaking out the folds of his robe. and said, "May God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep this promise. So may such a man be shaken out and empty." And the whole assembly said amen, and they praised the Lord and did just as they had promised. Slide 137. Nehemiah's leadership is very evident in that he did not accept the allotment of food and taxes the Persian government permitted him to levy. As the incoming governor of the province that now comprised Jerusalem, Nehemiah could have, for himself and for all of his retainers, could have required the Jews to give him an allotment of food and taxes. And in fact, prior governors had done exactly that very thing. But Nehemiah suspended this levy of taxes for at least a dozen years, even though it meant that his personal expenses to support his staff must have been enormous. Nehemiah, out of his own personal expenses, paid for his himself and all of his staff that was there to assist him in the leadership of the Jews, and he did not charge the people who were rebuilding the wall anything. He refused to engage in any kind of mortgage foreclosures, and this is probably the meaning of the last phrase in verse 16 when he says, "We did not acquire any land." That probably doesn't mean they were, isn't a general reference to buying land, but to foreclosing on land because of loans that people had made and could not pay back the interest or the principal. So the work continued. The gaps in the wall were now being closed. Slide 138. So, as you get to chapter 6, the report came to Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and all of the enemies of those that were against the Jews that the wall had now been closed. All of the gaps had been closed. There were certainly parts of the walls that seemed to have been standing after the destruction of the Babylonians earlier, but those gaps had all been closed now, and everything seemed secure except that the gates had not yet been set. Now, the Samaritan, Ammonite, and Arab communities, of course, did not want to see Jerusalem secure. And so in another effort to stifle those efforts, they repeatedly invited Nehemiah to meet them at some outside location. So they sent him reports on several occasions. "Come, let's meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But Nehemiah correctly perceived that they were scheming to harm him. He knew that if he actually were caught in a village outside of the protection of Jerusalem, his life would end very shortly. And so he refused to do that. He sent messengers to them and said, "I'm working in this project. I can't stop to do this." And although they sent him the same request 4 times, each time he gave them the same answer, that he would refuse to come. Finally, when Nehemiah refused to come and meet them at this outside location, they actually threatened to send a report to Artaxerxes, all the way back in the Persian administrative capital, that Nehemiah was planning a revolt. And the genius of this threat, if it can be called that, is that they wrote it in an unsealed scroll. And of course, it's described in chapter 6 and verse 6. It's rumored among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're building the wall. The fact that this was in an unsealed scroll meant that it was available to be read by anybody who would see it or anybody who would carry it. And so this would effectively start a rumor, and the idea, of course, behind it was that the rumor would spread. And as the rumor spread, eventually the rumor would get all the way to Artaxerxes, and by that time would be big enough and have enough supporters that Artaxerxes might take it seriously. But nonetheless, in spite of this threat and this unsealed letter that was to be sent to Artaxerxes, Nehemiah refused to be intimidated. He said to them, "This is not happening. We're not planning a revolt. We're not revolting against Persia, and you're just making this up." And so Nehemiah refused to allow their intimidation to sway him. In verses 10 through 13, apparently they even hired a false prophet to discourage him with threats on his life. They said, "Your life is being threatened and you need to go into the temple because men are coming to kill you." But Nehemiah said, "No, I'm not going to do that. Why should I go to the temple to save my life? I won't do that. And so even though they tried to hire this false prophet to do this, Nehemiah refused to be intimidated. And in fact, apparently they hired more than one, because it mentions particularly a prophetess by the name of Noadiah. And then it says the rest of the prophets that have been trying to intimidate me. This is in verse 14. And so apparently there were several of these people that tried to mimic prophethood in order to sway Nehemiah from his purpose. Slide 139. In all of this struggle, Nehemiah continually prays for God's help. You begin hearing his prayers at the very beginning of the book, when he first heard that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down while he was still in Persia. And he repented in behalf of his people, and he prayed for God's forgiveness for their sins. And then when he was going to approach Artaxerxes and felt that he would speak to him about this situation, he prayed for success, that God would assist him. He prayed a curse upon Sanballat and Tobiah for their insults and their encouragement back in chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, because they were intimidating him. He prays and said, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads and give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. Don't cover up their guilt and don't blot out their sins, because they've thrown insults in the face of the builders." This imprecatory curse is very much like the imprecatory psalms that you will find in the book of Psalms. He also prayed when they were intimidated by actual threats on their lives, when they were building the wall and when they posted the guards. There is this, in a sense, a somewhat humorous statement that we prayed and we posted a guard. So they put action to their prayers as well. And he pled for God to remember his generosity to the people after he had deliberately not charged interest to the people, and he had deliberately supported his own staff out of his own pocket, so to speak. He prayed God that God would remember his generosity. Remember me with favor, O God, for all that I've done these people. He prayed for strength to finish the work, that the Lord would strengthen his hands. And finally, he prays in chapter 6 and verse 14 against those who are trying to intimidate me. And he says, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, because of what they have done. Remember this prophetess, Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who've been trying to intimidate me." Slide 140. Well, the wall finally was completed at the end of 52 days. In chapter 6, verses 15 and 16, you'll notice the statement that the wall was completed on the 25th of the lull, which was 52 days after they started. And when the enemies heard about that, they began to lose confidence because they realized that they were not going to deter Nehemiah from this work. The work had gone on despite all of the harassment that had happened from the local antagonists. Repeatedly, they had attempted to foil the progress, and they had even tried to infiltrate the Jewish community. As you read verses 17 through 19, the last verses in chapter 6, it says, "In those days the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them, for many in Judah were under oath to him." Now, the fact that they were under oath to him probably refers to some sort of trade agreements. And on the basis of those trade agreements, and as well as what apparently seems to be intermarriage between some of the children of the Jewish nobility and some of the children of non-Jewish locals, this intimidation had continued without reprieve. And so Tobiah tries to infiltrate the Jewish community to discourage Nehemiah. But all of that is without without success, because Nehemiah refused to be intimidated. Slide 141. Finally, as we begin chapter 7, the gates are set in place. Gatekeepers were appointed, and a schedule was set for opening and closing the gates. The gates would not open in the morning until the sun was well up, and they would close in the evening before it was dark. Jerusalem was now secure. With the gates in place and the walls in place, those who were inside the city could no longer be intimidated by the locals who were against them. Many of the Jews, however, perhaps most of them by this time, lived outside the city walls. Prior to the gate reconstruction, to the building of the city walls, there would have been no real reason for them to have lived inside the city. They would have been a long distance away from their farming plots. And so, as it says in chapter 7 and verse 4, it says the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. Slide 142. Now, a further word about gates. Because typically gates were made of wood, they don't survive over the centuries, and so we don't really have any good examples of excavated wooden gates. They just haven't survived the centuries. But there are some remnants of an Assyrian gate called the Balawat gates that were constructed by Shalmaneser III about roughly 4 centuries or so before the time we're talking about. Remnants of these gates and the bands that held the planking together were excavated in 1878. And these gates were quite large gates. They're about 7 meters high. And should you happen to visit the British Museum in London, England, you can see a reconstructed example of those gates and the bands that held them together. And that is what this picture is depicting. These are from the British Museum. Slide 143. I should also say a word about the size of the city of Jerusalem. Going back all the way to the time of David, the city was quite small, just on the small hill of Ophel. And in these small 3 depictions, you can see in the first one there is a blue area that depicts about a 10-acre section of the hill of Ophel. This city of David, which originally belonged to the Jebusites, was taken by David from the Jebusites and then made into his capital. And this is the original city of Jerusalem that David established as the capital for the nation. It wasn't very large, about 10 acres, and the population was estimated by archaeologists to be probably around 2,000 people. By the time of David's son Solomon, however, this area was enlarged considerably because of the expansion of the royal palaces to the north of the Hill of Ophel and, of course, the building of the temple. Now the size of the city was about 3 times its former size, about 32 acres, and the estimated population would have been up to roughly about 5,000 people. Its greatest expansion came some centuries later in the time of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah lived, of course, in the time when the northern nation went into exile to Assyria, and many refugees fled to the south to Jerusalem. And in the archaeological excavations of Jerusalem, archaeologists estimate that the city nearly quadrupled in size in the time of Hezekiah. To protect these people, Hezekiah extended the wall section so that the area now of population was about 125 acres, and this is the large blue area that you see in the third square. Here, the estimated population would have been about 25,000 people. However, with the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar of Jerusalem and the subsequent exile, most of these people were taken to Babylon as refugees, and so they were settled in Babylon until they were able to return with the first group that came with Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel a number of years earlier. But now that Nehemiah is building the walls, we're not sure which set of walls he built on the west side of Jerusalem. There is some debate about that. Slide 144. This photograph of Jerusalem, and this looks northward. In the bottom left of the photograph, you see the Hill of Ophel. And then in the top center of the photograph, you see the Temple Mount with the Muslim Dome of the Rock that sits approximately where the Second Temple stood. It is on the western side of this that we're not sure where Nehemiah's wall was. There is one theory that says the wall was simply enclosing the old city of David, so a relatively small area of the city. And then there is a second theory that says that Nehemiah was closing up the gaps in the wall that were left from the time of Hezekiah. And if they were following the line of Hezekiah's wall, then the city would have been quite large, even though there weren't very many people living in it. Slide 145. Here you see the two theories depicted in a drawing. The striped area is the first view, the minimalist view, that the wall section Nehemiah built was not around the entire city that had been sent into exile, but just the hill of Ophel that goes back to the time of David. We're not sure then whether this area was 125 acres or 32 acres. But in any case, the book of Nehemiah says that there was a lot of area that was not yet built, and there were not a lot of people living in it at this time. I'm more inclined to the opinion that Nehemiah closed up the wall sections that were built by Hezekiah, so that there would have been a much larger space that was walled than just the smaller area. But that's a debate that is probably going to be ongoing for some time, and at present at least, neither the text of the Bible nor the spade of the archaeologist has settled this question for us. Slide 146. Chapter 7 largely describes the efforts to populate the city inside the walls. If Jerusalem was to be populated by the people who came back from exile, and of course that had been the goal all along, then it was really important for them to be able to once again prove that they were properly Jewish. One of the concerns all along was to maintain a pure pedigree for the Jews who returned from exile. And that has been a concern all the way back from the book of Ezra into the book of Nehemiah. And so what you have in chapter 7 is a registration for those who are going to live inside the city walls. And this registration is based on the genealogical records of those who returned from exile. And it goes back to those first records that were kept from the days of Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. So as you see in chapter 7 and verse 5, it says, God put into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. And I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. And then there is the listing of all of those who came out of Babylon. As you look at this listing and you compare it with Ezra chapter 2, which is the earlier edition of this listing, you'll find that they are nearly identical. There are a few small differences, mostly differences that are believed to be transcription problems in Hebrew text over many centuries, but very largely they are the very same list. And that brings us to the end of lecture 12.